Over the years, a bunch of people have asked for very specific content about radios or digital type radio meshtastic sorts of things. And I've been hesitant to make that content for two reasons. Number one, it already exists on the internet. And the other is that I generally learn it from those guys that are already posting it. So the best thing to do is send you to their actual channels. And one of the most informative is Josh over at Ham Radio Crash Course. Welcome back to another T-Rex Talk. My guest today is my friend Josh, who runs Ham Radio Crash Course on YouTube and has done a bunch of other stuff. Our editor might even cut some of our previous conversation into this episode because we've already been talking for 4 minutes on projects that we're working on, stuff that we want to do, and so forth. So let's begin the conversation a little bit more formally, Josh. Sure. You talk about ham radio stuff a lot, and T-Rex Talk has talked about radios and emergency communication stuff. Our last radio guest was Gaston over at the Tech Prepper, who you probably know as, is it KT7RUN?
KT7, yeah, I think so.
Yeah. So we ham radio guys only know each other by our call signs, but
that's right.
Can't think of yours off the top of my head at the moment.
NAZ. Yeah, no, it's I actually remember people by name more than call signs.
Yeah. So we have talked only on the internet, but we've talked for years. The very first T-Rex video about radios, I think I sent you the script. I think I sent you the script or the outline to get your sign off on it. And we have chatted intermittently from here on out. But originally, you were not a ham radio guy. Even your YouTube channel, I think, started off on kind of a different direction. So.
Yeah, definitely. By the way, thanks for having me out here, Isaac. Appreciate it.
You're welcome.
So
sorry not to let you talk. We've already been talking for 4 minutes.
No. I started on YouTube in 2006. So I've been out there for a while and seen lots of the changes that have happened. And it all started from my wife, Leia, who is like, hey, you got a lot of hobbies. Why don't you try explaining to people how you do all these hobby things? And this was right when like YouTube started paying you a little bit of scratch here for putting up videos. And I did that, and it took years and years and years, but eventually I got partnered and all that stuff. I even dabbled in daily vlogging for like 600 plus days straight. So I've done a little bit of everything. Wow. But in 2018, I kind of did the hard pivot and said, look, after all these videos I've made, the thing that has been the most interesting to me and the most passionate thing I'm about is amateur radio, specifically, well, any kind of radio, but primarily amateur radio.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Before that, I think you were doing some gun content amongst your hobbies.
Yeah, I love skeet and trap. That's one of my favorite shooting sports, and I used to shoot multiple times a week, largely before I had kids. I would go down to the local place, and it's called Triple B's. They're now gone, but man, it was a lot of fun. I was in a club, used to shoot semi-competitively at like the local level. And I still try and get out there, get my Browning 725 out and have a little bit of fun. But handguns, rifles. California has obviously changed multiple times as far as gun ownership in multiple decades. But there's still a huge community of gun enthusiasts here. And I still occasionally get out there to shoot when I can.
Yeah. Yeah. So you've been doing radio stuff for a while, and you have a pretty wide selection of content. There's some of your stuff that's very much geared at beginners. There's some of the stuff that is pretty deep dive into advanced amateur radio concepts. I think one of the things that you are best at, though, is explaining like new stuff. Like your first coverage of Meshtastic, experimenting with the different boards, explaining what it was, I think was really good. Like some of the best Meshtastic stuff on the internet. And I should know because I was researching that heavily. I think I watched all the Meshtastic videos. I had flashed firmware on a couple different devices. I was talking to people in the developer community, and your video came out, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is it's exactly the video that I was preparing to make without knowing about it, and you just made it. So you have a technical background as well and do technical stuff for work. So does that tie nicely together with some of the hobbies?
I think it does. And my background specifically started out as software engineering at Boeing. I started there in 2014 as an intern and kind of worked there for 13 years in satellite communication, ground station type stuff, payload communication, all of that, and moved into systems engineering, which is just a kind of glorified way of saying we work the requirements and kind of design how the function of whatever system we're going to deploy and sell. And at kind of a younger-ish age, they would have me kind of cover the presentations in some cases, or I would talk to users, and users could be, Air Force pilots, Navy lieutenants for different stations that we were running, all that stuff. And I would just kind of walk them through, like, what are we saying we're going to do? What have we actually developed up to this point? And where do we see ourselves going with our schedule? And kind of just explaining out the hows and the whys and all that stuff. And this is all to people that don't come from an engineering background. And so, just, I guess, doing it for a long time, it's helped tremendously from the explaining things in video format, because it's kind of the same thing. If you can look at a camera, you can look at a person and just kind of explain what's really going on here. How does this work? How does it function?
Yeah. Yeah. So satellite communications are, they are radio communications, just with a little bit more infrastructure than amateur guys generally use. But how is it that you did that as a job and then also have this adjacent hobby? Did they spur each other on, or for some people that's work and hobby too close together is no good?
I was always one of those guys who would go home after working on a computer all day and get back on a computer. So I've never had any problem doing similar to adjacent things.
Yeah.
But I was in Boy Scouts many, many years ago, and I had this scoutmaster that was holding a handheld radio, and he was trying to explain to me, I'm talking on a repeater, and I didn't understand what he was talking about, because I don't know that he explained it perfectly, but I was also very much in the internet kid age of time. So I'm like, is this email? What are you doing? Flash forward though to, God, it was like the first couple of years I was at Boeing, and I ended up meeting this older gentleman who used to run a lab, software integration lab that we had in Anaheim. And he was talking to me, and we were talking about the technologies that we were working with. And he's like, you ever heard of ham radio? And I'm like, yeah, I think that was that thing the Scoutmaster was doing, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, yeah, come check this out. And he takes me back to his office, and he pulls out this Yaesu radio that had a GPS dongle on top of it. And he explains what APRS is. So automatic packet reporting system, this way of squawking out basically sound that goes over the radio, can be picked up by another radio, and then can be converted from sound into text. And I was like, oh, this is sweet. And he's like, well, there's a whole radio store right down the street in Anaheim called the Ham Radio Outlet. We should check it out. And so we went over on one lunch, and literally the guy that I bought my first amateur radio from still works there. His name's Billy Bob, or it's just Bob. And I got my Gordon West book, started studying it immediately, and I was like, oh, this is perfect. This is just what I want to do. And yes, sure enough, it just kind of took off from there.
Nice. Well, so you're seeing kind of two sides of a coin, because in my limited experience and opinion, ham radio, the amateur radio community, is largely older, time-tested, proven stuff that you can really touch and feel and build your own antennas. And APRS is 30-plus years old at this point as a digital packet protocol.
Yeah.
And there's very few people working on really cutting-edge new stuff in the amateur space, partly because the hacker kind of early hacker nature of it, and partly because if you want to get involved in really super cutting-edge, profitable, expensive RF engineer type stuff, you either need to be building new LTE equipment for the telecoms,
sure,
or maybe a new Wi-Fi spec for consumer electronics companies, or really good communication technology for aerospace, military, industrial complex kind of thing. So the really high-level, cutting-edge digital communication and RF development happens in places that most of us can't see. And you have some background in that with the satellite stuff. And then amateur is usually not trying to be super cutting edge. So you've seen both sides of this. Have I characterized it well, or is it a little too broad brush, a little too stereotypical?
I think you nailed it, particularly in today's world, because we've had kind of the microization of so many of our components and things that we use in computers that you just really can't replicate that in the amateur space at the hobbyist level anymore. Like you can still go buy a kit, any kind of radio kit that uses through-hole resistors and capacitors and all that stuff and build yourself your own radio, but it's going to be like a super heterodyne radio. It's going to be of an older style. And so now even the radio kits that have more of a cutting edge stuff in it, those are almost like discrete components that you don't build. You still do the traditional through hole, and then you look over here and there's like, oh, there's your Wi-Fi, adapter, or your Bluetooth dongle, or whatever. SDRs obviously now are bigger than ever, and that's kind of going to continue to grow. And I think those are somewhat impenetrable for a lot of hobbyists. So I think it's almost a piggyback scenario where you have all those professionals, the people that are out there doing the LTE stuff, working for the military, the government, or some kind of private entity that's doing some really cool whiz bang stuff. But I think if they're nerdy enough to be operating in that space, they probably also do this at home. And they may have the capability to design some kind of new technology and then reach out or have just someone that they subcontract out to the ability to print PCBs that are way more vastly complicated and use very small surface mount parts. They could do that. In fact, I know people who are doing that they will design a chip, ship that out to China or some other country, and then they'll get back the boards, and then they'll have a firmware developer. Maybe they can dabble in some of the firmware development, and then they'll basically have a radio kit that works in that function.
Okay, well maybe we should talk after, and also maybe I should be nicer to the military industrial complex than I have been recently, so that guys who are engaging in this very cutting edge stuff and then at home experimenting with stuff a little more accessible, could reach out to me and we could do some projects together. But let's say we found some of those guys who are really good at that stuff.
Sure.
Your friends, my friends. What does ham radio need? Where does it go next? Is there an obvious thing that's not being done? Because I definitely see trends. I'm not super old, but I'm old enough to have seen trends. Like the Baofeng radios were a sea change in one sense. SDRs that you can just, buy an RTL SDR, plug it in, and see the entirety of bands. That's a huge change. There's two radios in particular that are really interesting to me right now. One is the Quansheng K5, I believe, which is super hackable. Now, it's not super powerful, but people are writing their own firmwares, and it can do all kinds of stuff. And then there's a bunch of people that sell this radio as the Vero N76, but I think Radiotti has a version, and BTEC has the UV Pro version, and it's a very modern feeling handheld because it has GPS and Bluetooth built in, and you connect it to your phone, and the app will update the firmware, and the app will let you program the radio. Like, it just feels very modern. Now, it's got some janky bits, but those two radios feel like kind of the next wave of ham radio, where you can use an app to do old school APRS. What do you think is coming? Because you've been watching this for a lot longer than I have, and have seen more of these changes.
It's really hard to pinpoint where exactly it's going to go. It's if I could, then I'd be doing it, right? But yeah, it seemed to me that like one of the big sea changes in the 90s was this bringing smaller radios out. Like what comes to mind is like the Yaesu 817, this all band, all mode. The Tech Prepper, right? Loves that radio. That was kind of like the cool thing in the 90s. Like, whoa, I can have everything, and it's like small, super tiny, and it's got an internal battery. And then we saw the Baofeng, which it's a different group of people, but also a big sea change in the terms of
$25. Yeah,
Amazon, $17 right now. You can get one on Amazon. I was just looking at it. Now with that I think lowered the barrier to entry for a lot of people. My first amateur radio was like $250 right back in 2007 or 2006. But the point I saw the next one as being now everything's having like a USB interface. So like an HF radio or a handheld that has a USB interface, not just for charging or anything like that, but to connect your phone or a computer to it. So the interfacing of the radio and having the radio kind of just be the RF modulator, and then have all these apps that can use it in different capacities is, I think, it's already happening. We're kind of already there, but these ingenious apps have been like really, really powerful. So one that always comes to mind is Radio Mail, which is on iOS, and it is possibly one of the best WinLink applications you can use for doing email, right? Email over RF. So whether it's HF or VHF, UHF, whatever, you can use this cool application on your phone to do it. And with some of these radios, you can do it wirelessly, right? So Wi-Fi or wireless LAN into the radio, and then the radio, again, is more the black box that does the modulation and sending out. So let's go back to what we were talking about earlier with the software-defined radio. Maybe it's just a little pack of cards like that QDX, right, by QRP Labs. It's a pack of cards with a light on it. You provide it 12 volts and an antenna, and then you connect to it either via USB or Bluetooth or whatever you want to do. And then your phone or your tablet is how you interface the device. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that as the generation of knobs and dials starts to become less active in the community. We're going to see, well, I mean, the iPad generation at some point is going to become hams. And then now you're going to see that sea change happen there, where they demand the interfaces change to kind of meet their needs.
Yeah. And I actually find as I'm getting older, I'm kind of going the other way. Like I want to bring physical buttons and knobs back for certain things.
Sure. Well, they got a market for that too. Those exist.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things though, where I completely agree. Like when I find myself using a device, and there's a number of Chinese devices out there that are kind of like this, where I see them leaning into a new territory, new frontier, and it's very exciting. But also it's like, wow, this is the first radio with a touchscreen. And then I'm like, hang on a second, though. This touchscreen is 2 inches wide. I already have this in my pocket.
Exactly.
Can we just Bluetooth to this?
Exactly.
And then I'm like, oh, I'm one of them iPad kids now.
To go back to the example you gave, which is the V76, I think was the radio you mentioned. So I love the capability of being able to Bluetooth, and the app it's surprisingly well functioning, but it's still that like, I call it Chinesium sometimes. The Chinese effect of radio is, let's throw every possible feature we can into this so that we can add it on the bulleted spec sheet. We'll be damned if 75% of it works, but we just got to get that feature list so big and so populated that people will buy it. Versus if you take something like a Japanese radio that will maybe spec down a little bit, but the interfaces are very solid and they perform very well and they do what you expect. I think we're going to get more hobbyist software like Radio Mail that is a very good interface. It's very easy to use, and it's just going to interface with these radios, and you're going to go, oh, this is just like using Spotify, or this is just like using Instagram. But I'm connected to my black box that's connected to my LAN at home, also connected to an HF antenna. And hey, look, I'm doing HF radio. I'm doing amateur radio. I'm making digital contacts. I'm sending images. I'm sending email, whatever. And it's over the RF, not over the internet. You're going point to point. Now you're this disconnected from the internet type network, if you will, which is I think fantastic. I mean, we need more of that for sure.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, and I would say for a bunch of different levels. One, resiliency, infrastructure that you don't control, you is less predictable. And it's easy to take less responsibility for stuff you don't control. Taking more control over your own stuff means you should be motivated to be more responsible, be a more responsible person, but also just decentralization, having not everything be in one basket, I think is huge. So I'm excited about that. And I think as devices get, smarter, we should be able to open up the other devices like that Vero radio. The app is very clunky, and the interface on the radio is really clunky too. Like APRS messages get received well and you can see them, but there's a lot of little quality of life stuff. Like it doesn't decode any of the message. It doesn't turn anything into weather icons. Like it doesn't do any of the stuff that the Kenwood radios do. But we could theoretically like update. We could be pushing updates to that mobile app every 2 days, and we could be building new mobile app interfaces fast. I probably shouldn't talk about this on the podcast because people will hear this eventually, but we may be doing some mobile app development. And then like I have, let's see if
it's like a
focus
Garmin
on this, but this is a Garmin watch. You can't really see the watch face, but this is our watch face.
Yeah,
like Garmin spent, I don't know how many years building this watch, but a guy that I know and I built a watch face for this watch in days. And then when there's a tweak or an ad, it happens as fast as Garmin, approves the app update. So that is a really cool thing that I hope that people lean into or able to lean into with some of these radios. There's a faster development cycle on the software side that
absolutely.
If it could just be a little more accessible would be great. I do love that the Chinese radios have this great price point, and they also, for better or for worse, don't really care about FCC regulations very much.
Right.
Which I think you would agree has some downsides occasionally, but it has a cool upside in that, yes, they do want to add everything to the spec sheet, whether it works or not. But oftentimes they add cool stuff that nobody thought of before. And I think that gets people's brain going, like gets people thinking about what could be possible or useful. And some of the Japanese radio companies would never have done that because it would be hard to get FCC certification, or somebody might ask about this or something like that. And it's kind of I have a libertarian streak to me. Like I think it's interesting when you find areas where people bypass regulations and then you watch what the result of that is.
Same with me. Very much similar mindset. It's kind of interesting, and I want to touch on that point for a second. The issue that I have with radios that, and we're dancing around, I think, a term called spurious emissions, right? That's where,
oh yeah, for sure,
when you're transmitting on the stated frequency on the radio, it's also transmitting on harmonics of basically multiples of that frequency. I did a video where I wanted to see how far can I transmit with what we would call a dirty radio. And I was off on the third and fourth harmonic about a mile from my home, and I could hear, I had an SDR running at home, and I could pick up my own signal. So if you put this, we buy Baofangs, we buy cheap Chinese radios because they're cheap. And if you stay awake at night, like I do, going through multiples of what if scenarios, and you're thinking about, hey, I want a radio that I may run low power because I only want to talk to a couple of local guys a quarter mile away from me, whatever. Now you got to think about, well, what about all those even harmonics of this dirty radio I bought that someone that may have a very wide broadband SDR is just listening for whatever reason? Why, I don't know. And they stumble upon your primary frequencies, second harmonic, third harmonic. You're putting out extra information that you probably shouldn't. But our big problem with Chinese stuff is it's not the radios per se, it's all the electronics. It's the dirty wall warts, the LED lights with pulse width modulating, power dimmers, and all this stuff, the technology that we're cramming our houses with. That's where we're seeing the noise floor on all of our frequencies get saturated by this junk. That's where the FCC really should be pointing their efforts, and I don't think they're doing a good enough job there, personally.
Yeah, I still live pretty far away. Like I'm in a neighborhood, but I'm in the neighborhood that's in the middle of nowhere, and neighbors are pretty far away. So I haven't noticed RFI too much. But in places where you have densely packed folks, and they have these cheap Chinese wall warts doing bad DC-AC conversions and up conversions, the amount of signal generation that's going on is pretty interesting. I think that is kind of a fascinating thing. And obviously there's people who are concerned about the health benefits, but even just from a wattage, wastage, but also if you want to have decentralized radio communications and alternative radio communications, then interference is just not helping. It's
no, it's not.
bad.
And that's also a good point. I heard that a lot. I did a video on. Have you seen the cattail antennas, the wearable antennas?
Yes,
that people put on like
I have
load
mixed feelings
harnesses?
about those. I watched your video, and to be honest, I was a little bit disappointed because I was hoping you were going to do like 10 or 15 super complex laboratory tests and like finally put this to bed once and for all. And you did a T-Rex Labs level video, like not a real lab, but like we went outside with this thing.
Well, so I have a listening station at my house that can record signal to noise ratio in numbers and then also do audio recordings. And so we use that.
It was a good test. I just wanted to see like a completely bulletproof. Yeah.
Well, so I do that for benchmarking antennas against antennas. So if you took 5 antennas out and you do the same benchmark sitting in the same location, you get a good idea of where they rank. But I got a ton of comments from people that are like, oh, I don't want that RF as close as you have it or whatever. And I'm like, but you got a Baofeng that you hold up against your face and the aerial is pointed like, because again, vertical antennas radiate broadside 90 degrees perpendicular. So you're already radiating your face by holding a handheld up against your body.
Yeah.
So the cat's out of the bag on that one. And all these handhelds are 5 watts. Even a 10-watt handheld is not really a problem. But I was surprised how many people still have issues with this concept of non-ionizing radiation. So you have to be...
You said it right there. You just said the word radiation. I know that's bad.
Well, yeah, right. So everything radiates to some degree. If you have a power supply in your house, that's radiating something, right? With a radio, it's designed to radiate RF, radio frequencies, on a specific frequency. And if it's below a certain frequency, and we're talking tens and plus of gigahertz before you get to ionizing radiation, right? When you're talking X-rays and that kind of stuff. Anything below that, the only effect you really have to the human body is tissue damage. So like a skin burn, like almost a sunburn. Now, sure, if you have a high enough power on 70 centimeters, which is a common UHF band, and if you do have that right up against your eyeballs, for instance, that could damage you, right? Instantly hurt your eyes. Yeah. But a handheld, even
the vitreous fluid likes that particular frequency. Yeah.
But if you have a handheld and you're talking on it all day long, even at 70 centimeters at 5 watts, there's not a problem. You're not really going to have any kind of medical issue with that at all. And I think actually, you're mentioning the word radiation. I think that's exactly what it is. Preconceived notions, right? Not necessarily backed up by science.
I am curious about those because what I like about the body-worn antennas is obviously the ergonomics. Like there's nothing sticking up, there's nothing snagging. You put your radio in a pouch, you thread it through the pouch. All you got to do is throw on your Ready Rig. T-Rex Arms has a brand new updated Ready Rig, by the way, now available in black. But that, you pre-weave your antenna and your comms into that thing and boom, you're good to go. The downside is not so much health-wise, but just it's not that you're absorbing damage, but you're 70% water and you're absorbing a lot of that RF energy and just stopping it from getting to its destination.
There it is.
And I'd love to do a test sometime where we compare body-worn antennas with the little short stubby nub antennas, because they both have great ergonomic capability, and just figure out, obviously you're sacrificing some power reach capability with those smaller antennas. You're sacrificing some with the signal occlusion once you wrap the antenna around your watery body. It would be really interesting to do some tests and figure that out.
I'm almost I could probably go on record in saying the stubby antenna will be the underperformer. The body-worn antenna will be better.
Okay, yeah.
Almost guaranteed.
Yeah.
Particularly if you follow any of the guidance, a lot of them are like, poke the tip up or have the tip close to the top, and then you can just, boop, pop it up. And then that's going to work a lot better. The stubby antenna is just a coil of wire. It's just a really condensed coil of wire. And that's just not that good of an actual radiator, to use that term again. Versus receiver works fine or decently well. Transmitter, though, not so much.
Yeah. Well, this is another thing that everybody has different use cases. So I have had my amateur radio license for over 10 years.
All right.
And I have used it shockingly rarely. because I listen way more than I talk. Now, you may not believe that because I'm doing a podcast right now where we're going to talk for a long time. But I have spent a huge amount of time listening, which doesn't require a license. And receiving is just a million times easier than transmitting. Like, just picking up a signal can be done off of drain pipes and fences. And like, there's all kinds of ways of picking up a signal, and it works great until you want to try to get a signal out. So for those people who are interested in gathering intelligence, receiving is great. And all this conversation about how do I broadcast, or no, not broadcast, how do I transmit? How do I get my signal for the farthest range? You may certainly find yourself in an emergency situation where you need to get your signal out to the maximum range possible. But also you could just be like, hey, you know what? I like to listen to, these particular bands, listen to these particular nets. I don't really have, my 2 cents isn't really necessary in this particular group that I'm a part of. And I can just keep tabs on stuff, and a little radio that I can, throw a coil of wire out here works well. What is your transmit to receive ratio, generally speaking, as a hobbyist?
You and I are very similar, actually. So before I became an amateur radio operator, one of my radio hobbies was shortwave listening. So, old school shortwave radios, right? Single sideband and AM. I didn't come to amateur radio like a lot of people did back in the 90s and early 2000s, which was CB. A lot of people graduated from CB into amateur radio. I came from the shortwave listening, right? I would literally, as a kid, I'd have a long wire, and I'd run outside out my back window, and I'd sit there with my little handheld and scan around, listening to who I could hear. Listening is fundamental. I mean, that's the most information gathering thing you can do, whether it's the good times or the bad times or the whatever, right? We just had a hurricane pass through Louisiana, and the hurricane watch net was active, and I could hear it from my house. And so I was listening to what was going on there. And we've had multiple we have disasters right now in California, multiple fires, right? Where having that information acquisition capability of radio is something that is real time. It's incredibly useful. I've got a scanner next to me, an SDS 200. I've got multiple handhelds. I got my VHF, UHF station that I can all simultaneously listen to gather information. And I'll tell you, I'm probably 10% transmitting in those cases because it's just going on around me. I found a good solution for bringing information in. And then a lot of the times, like you, I talk a lot on video or doing my live streams, and we do these after chats where we're trying to take live questions, and I'll be transmitting on FT8 or a digital mode, making contacts with people while I'm also carrying on helping out people with their radio questions and all that other stuff. So I'm not really the old school get in front of the microphone guy and then sit there and just rag chew for hours because I've got a family. I got young kids. My wife's going to yell at me to go help with homework and go to some after-school event. I can't just have that time to commit to just talking right on the radio.
Yeah, and there's other great ways to talk to people, face-to-face conversations with your own family and friends. Like
yeah, absolutely.
So I think that this is an important thing, and I do this with all sorts of technologies, where I'm like, I want the most performance, and it's like, yeah, but I'm never actually going to use this particular product in a scenario where I need the greatest performance. So like this little camera right here, it has shot a ton of content, and it's amazing. I have no complaints. It's the best camera I've ever owned. I still read about upcoming cameras. There's not anything else that I need or want. Like there's nothing wrong with the autofocus here, even though I was, couldn't get the watch quite there. Yeah, low light performance is great. I don't need a better camera. The amount of time I spend on my gear acquisition syndrome, despite having all the tools that I need and a large to-do list, is sort of embarrassing. But I think that that's something that a lot of people should think about and just say, like, you know what? The perfect HF radio isn't here yet. Lab 99, whoever is going to make the next perfect HF man-pack radio hasn't released it yet. But I could get this, and I could listen, and I could get that, and I could listen. I get this, and I could practice. I could get this, and I could do that. So I think that getting started at a low level and experimenting is worth a lot. And for me, I I need to do to learn. And so if I read stuff, it really doesn't sink in if I'm not doing something. And so doing something at a low level, even if I'm reading about the high level, is huge. And so my recommendation for anyone who's listening to the podcast and wondering about how to get started is, however you can start is the best way that you should start in some ways. So
yeah, interestingly enough, let's just piggyback on the Baofeng thing. $17 Baofeng, go to Amazon, boom, there you go. And you're like, okay, well that's voice, VHF, UHF, talk on repeaters, simplex, walkie-talkie style talking. But you could go make yourself a cable or buy one off of Amazon that will connect your phone to the radio, or something with an audio jack to the radio. And then you can use an application on your phone, and now you're doing APRS. It's not the best iteration of APRS. There's some downsides to it, but it's certainly above and beyond what that $17 radio has any real business of being able to do. And all we did was we just interfaced it with a cable. And I think that's a really important thing to take away with amateur radio in particular, is that whichever radio you have access to, there's likely something you can do, and probably something a ham has done to use it in unique ways that you probably never even thought of. Like taking a 90s radio and being able to interface it into your laptop. And now all of a sudden you've got great digital mode capability, and you're able to talk with your radio further than ever, but just because you interfaced it to a computer, right? That's a big thing that amateur radio allows you to do that the other radio services really don't, is this digitalization of everything has been really, really beneficial for demonstrating how radio works and functions in terms of getting your signal out there, but then also leveraging capabilities to be able to send information in, I think, ways that are more novel and convenient than just sitting in front of the radio and talking than, while you're doing other things.
Yeah. So if you were counseling as someone to how to begin, as your YouTube channel often has, and as you were often doing direct to people during live streams.
Yeah.
What is sort of the best bang for your buck? Like, what are going to be some of the best skills that you can work on? Is it programming radios in Chirp? Is it figuring out repeaters? Like, what is a good starting point that's going to get you on the right track to like grasp and understand stuff?
I've always changed my answer to this question because I've answered it in so many different ways, and I think I've refined it over time. I'm now at the point where I kind of have to talk to the individual and ask them, what do you want to do with the radio? Like, what are you planning to do? If it's just walkie-talkie communication between off-road vehicles when you're out, without cell phone coverage, then, oh my gosh, almost anything will do it. The biggest piece of advice is have an antenna on the roof of your vehicle or something like that to get it outside of that Faraday cage you're driving around in, right? But if your goal is to, I want coast-to-coast ability to speak to someone, right? Not a specific someone, but just anyone, make a contact. Well, then that's probably high-frequency amateur radio. You need to get your general license to be able to do that most effectively. But it could be as cheap as a couple $100s in some cases. But the sky's the limit in that case. You're in this, upward trend market where it starts getting really, really expensive. Maybe you just want to do satellites, right? We have amateur radio satellites. And in that case, we're back to the $17 Baofeng. I'd say go get 2 of them, build yourself an antenna, a directional antenna that you can wave around with your hand, and have one of them set to UHF and have the other one set to VHF, and learn how to do satellite communication. If it were me, which is kind of funny because we got away from this a bit, but if it were me telling someone that's starting out, particularly if they're interested in high-frequency radio, which is kind of my most favorite aspect of amateur radio, those long-distance contacts, right? Going to a park, trying to make contacts for parks on the air or summits on the air, which is an event we have. I'd kind of encourage people to consider Morse code, because Morse code is great because you can buy a very inexpensive radio and it performs as well as like a 100-watt base station radio. And it's, the size of a deck of cards, and it's maybe putting out 3 watts, 5 watts in some cases, and you're only spending a couple of $100 all in for the whole setup, and you'd be surprised how effective it is. Another advantage, not many people know Morse code, so you're almost speaking in a language that a lot of people don't know. The difficulty is, how do you get your whole group of friends to learn Morse code, right? That's the
It's tricky.
how do you get your prepper group to get in on Morse code, right? It's sometimes a bridge too far. But you'd have to be a little bit more targeted in, like, what specific hints, right? That's my playlist on my channel is like, are you new to radio? Start here. And I tell people, well, how do I watch this? And it's like, it's simple. You scroll down the playlist, and if you find something interesting, watch that. And if you like it, well, then that's the thing you should probably check out, or, take some time in figuring it out. Because it's like when you say, what would you recommend people do with amateur radio? Say, well, it's kind of like, what would you do with a car? It's such a broad hobby that, how you use a vehicle is as broad as radio is in a lot of cases.
Yeah. So one of the ways that I've been categorizing radio, and my brother David, a bunch of us went and got our ham radio licenses at the same time, and then we just did simplex, VHF, UHF comms as a family and a friend group around an area. We've kind of settled on, there's three kinds of radios. You got your public radio, and there's times when you want to talk to as many people as possible. You want to be heard. You want public radio. You shouldn't allow to broadcast, but what you're actually trying to do is reach out to many people. So I feel like broadcasting is actually an okay word for reach out and be heard by many people, but the FCC has their own,
It generally means not receiving. It's not a two-way communication. Broadcast is just a radio station that's just blasting out tunes or morning shock jocks, all that stuff.
So that's your public radio. And then there's your private radio, which, if nobody knows Morse code except you and your buddy, you have private radio. The other way that we do that is we also have a business license here at T-Rex. So we do encrypted business band radio comms with the Hytera DMR radios. So that's private conversation, but it's not secret. Anybody who has an SDR can see us communicating. Anybody with a DF rig can see roughly where we're transmitting from. And so it's not secret communication, but it is private communication. They don't know what we're talking about.
Right.
And then there's that secret radio, which is that low probability of intercept, low probability of detect radio, which you want in certain circumstances. Certain people need that for operationally in an operational environment kind of thing, where you need to not only be intercepted, but you also want to avoid detection. And that is, I think it's helpful to break these apart, because there's a lot of people that confuse secret and private, and figure out what it is you actually trying to do with radio, because guys walking around with 10-watt radios with Chinese scramblers on them think that they're invisible. They're not invisible. No. People do this with night vision too. They put on night vision and they go, wow, I'm invisible. And then they turn on an IR flashlight and walk underneath streetlights. And it's like, that's actually kind of tricky. When you're wearing night vision, you can now see into the shadows. It's easy to lose track of where the shadows are, and you should probably stay in the shadows if you're trying to do nighttime stuff. So this assumption that you can just blast out, 8 watts of Chinese scrambler RF and be invisible is just like walking under streetlights wearing your night vision.
There's a couple of terms we get confused a lot on, which is encoding versus encryption, right? So you could have an encoded message in the clear, right? I could say something between you and I could say Alpha Bravo Charlie. And everybody hearing that just says, oh, he just said ABC. But we could have a code book somewhere that had some secret message. Bring beer to the ham shack. Josh is thirsty. Right. That only we knew about. That's an encoded message. But it was sent in the clear versus encrypting. Right. That's what you're doing with the FCC business radios, which is great. But in both cases, you are emitting RF. You're emitting power. And your direction can be determined with technology. I mean, old school technology of me just waving an antenna around, but with new technology with those Kraken SDRs, they'll find you in a heartbeat. And you better believe the FCC has better technology than that, and so does the government, and so does the military, et cetera, et cetera. So what's funny about that is, if you go back to that wearable antenna and you turn your radio from 5 watts down to 1 watt, it might be just enough to make it to the party you want to communicate with, and also greatly reduce that footprint of RF power that you're emitting. And that might be the best solution, going very old school of, hey, just lower the power output. In fact, that's an amateur radio rule, is you shouldn't be running 1,500 watts of power output when 5 watts will do it or 10 watts will do it. We should always be trying to lower our power output just enough to make that contact possible and no more.
Yeah. So it's interesting to see the different use cases get discussed. And I do think that there's some value in bringing guys, like I mentioned Brandon before, who's a former MARSOC Marine communicator guys that have experience using radio to do exactly what we're doing, make contact, communicate information, but with different constraints. And there's all kinds of techniques, obviously lowering power and picking directional antennas and terrain masking and various things like that you can do to try to keep your signal where it needs to be and not where it isn't. And be very efficient with your power usage, because you only have so many watt hours of batteries and you don't know how long you're going to be out in the field. And the consequences of you sending too much power the wrong direction are often incoming mortar fire. It is neat to have some of those guys in the loop to remind you of stuff that you wouldn't otherwise be thinking about.
Boy, you hit on so many things that I love talking about, like the batteries. That's your depreciable asset. You consider food, water, ammunition, your batteries, right? How protective you are for that thing's just vitally important. It's really interesting. The one thing that the military taps into that we actually don't have a really good solution for as civilians is spread spectrum communication, right? Mm-hmm. And then adding digital modes to that and encryption and all that stuff. Spread spectrum allows you to be a little bit more discreet with your RF, because you're now spreading your transmit space over multiple different frequency sets, that it's harder to DF against that. That's something that's a little bit more restrictive. There are radios out there, like there's a couple of 900 megahertz spread spectrum, just like family radios that you can buy, which are really interesting. But you're still within the 900 megahertz band. And given enough time, if you think that the person's transmitting over here, and you keep hearing it, and then you move over and do a simple triangulation, and now they're over there. Given enough time transmitting in one location, you're probably still going to be found, unless you're moving, and then that's going to be a little bit more effective in being evasive. But yeah, no, those are all really good points to think about when you're thinking about comms.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm really curious about mesh stuff. I mean, there's nothing super fancy about mesh radios. It's just like a whole bunch of little tiny repeaters that automatically repeat to each other. But the people who are doing the most interesting research and experimentation with this is probably military. There's plenty of Wi-Fi mesh radios, but the military guys probably have done some really extensive tests where it's like, how quickly do our repeaters have to repeat for us to avoid DF? Like how can we make this look like random echoes from everywhere as opposed to an individual network of pinpointable nodes? I'll bet you there's some cool top secret or slightly classified papers on this that I'm very curious about. But this, when you have rapid transmission through a mesh network, it's really interesting to graph that with inside the network topology and see how traffic is being routed and so forth. But I would love to have really cool electronic warfare technology that sees the traffic propagation from outside the network and what that actually looks like from a, direction finding or various other signals intelligence things. I think that would just be the coolest thing ever to be able to see, and interesting practical ramifications associated therein.
I would love to read that as well. And also the thing that's kind of cool about this mesh stuff, particularly if you like Meshtastic, right? That's kind of been the big buzz. That's all based on LoRa, right? Long range. There it is. I don't have one of those yet. Those are kind of hard to get right now. Those are kind of hard to get right now.
I ordered mine very early on, and it showed up today. See, the autofocus on this camera is actually a little bit too good. So this is the for those of you who are listening to the podcast, I apologize that we keep holding stuff up. For those of you who are watching the podcast, that is the SensCap low raw radio from Seed Studio. It's super tiny and it's very low power, but it can run Meshtastic.
You bought that from them?
I want to mess with this. I did, yeah.
Okay.
Took a long time to arrive.
Yeah.
So
that's interesting, right? So hold that up again, because here's a really cool idea: is what if you're just hiding in plain sight? So what if you had like 18 of those and you distributed them over like a 3 square mile area or something larger than that? So now the probability of detection is high. There's something going on, but you're also just hiding within the LoRaWAN frequency space. If you could do encryption with that, and so now you're sending encrypted messages, and sure, they're being retransmitted over mesh, but they'd be retransmitted over Meshtastic regardless if it was your nodes or someone else's nodes. So if you're in a pretty heavy environment with lots of these nodes, then we're all just brokering our own encrypted comms, not really knowing anything about them, just passing the message on kind of thing. And even if you DF'd one, it's probably not the one that you're looking for. It's not the guy on the other end. It's one of their other node boxes that's just out there.
And that's another advantage to go with low power. I forget if this is half a watt or if it's 100 milliamp or 100 milliwatts. It's very low power, which is lame if you want the maximum range from your device. But if you're trying to hide inside a mesh, I actually want the one that I'm wearing in my pocket
bingo
to be the low power one, and then I want it to talk to high power ones.
I want it just close enough to my good unit that's on top of my neighbor's roof with the good antenna, right? Go find that one. Go get my neighbor. No, I'm just kidding, of course. But yeah, that's the concept. And then you just spread that out, multiple nodes, and there you go. I do have to tell everybody, I know a lot of people are falling in love with the concept of Meshtastic. I get so many messages like, why doesn't it do voice? Why can't I send data? Why can't I send an image? It's like, guys, it's just text. And that's kind of the cool part about it, is it's just simple comms.
Yeah.
We want that.
Yes, exactly. Now, I admit that I have a love-hate relationship with Meshtastic.
Okay.
Do you have any experience? Do you have any experience with the Beartooth radios?
I do not.
So the Beartooth radios are an older technology. They're the XB Internet of Things protocol.
Okay.
Before LoRa, Internet of Things protocols had higher bandwidth and shorter range. LoRa came along at the time when it was like everybody's toaster has to be connected to everybody's refrigerator, and the batteries inside of this have to last for a year. So LoRa is just super slow because the focus was on range and battery life. And LoRa is awesome at that. The cool thing about Beartooth is it is voice, and it is pictures, and it is capable of doing more stuff.
Okay.
It's not quite as power efficient. I think the traffic routing might be better. It's interesting to tinker with. One downside, and I know though you wanted to talk about ATAC, but one downside to Beartooth is that I believe that they have their own private app, and their private app is not terrible, but to really get the most out of Beartooth, it shines as a ATAC plugin that talks to the radio. So to really make the most of it, you should use it with ATAC. The good news is it is the easiest way to use ATAC that I've ever come across. ATAC is another thing that I have a love-hate relationship with. It is complicated, and this little teeny tiny Meshtastic radio is going to get me back into Meshtastic. I was going to make a cool video where we tested Meshtastic and Beartooth side by side.
Okay.
And I got out my Meshtastic nodes and I looked at them and I went, never mind. It was one of those like, you know what? This video is going to be about usability. The fact that I looked at my Meshtastic nodes and went, nope. And the fact that I looked at Beartooth and I said, oh, one button on right there. I feel like that's a pretty good selling point for Beartooth.
See, you're probably right, although I haven't experienced it. But I think that kind of goes back to our conversation on the interfacing and the open nature of things. I think one of the reasons that Meshtastic has taken off is that a lot of these devices just need a LoRa module. And
yes,
the sky's the limit. Go get the rack wireless device, super power efficient. Go get a Heltec, go get a whatever. There's tons of people that LilyGo has a bunch, right? The little T-Deck device and all that. And then you just plug it into your computer, and the firmware flasher is available via the web. And you just go boop, boop. It's incredibly easy to use, even for somebody that's a novice. But really the success of BearTAC, or lack thereof, I don't know if they're still very popular or not, is probably that their closed architecture system has a really good interface that they created. And if you can't control that, you have to let it go to the community and let people like Meshtastic developers develop it in the open and answer the call that the consumers want. And you just hope that we keep getting access to cheap equipment that's able to work really well, right? But that's I think that's part of the reason why Meshtastic took off, is that it's cheap and it's relatively easy to get direct communication to the developers via Discord or whatever.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I like them both, but I like them for different things. I love the idea of, this is on my to-do list. Who knows if I ever get around to this, but on my to-do list is to set up enough solar powered or direct AC powered Meshtastic nodes around my town that we have a little mesh. And then just kind of use it and see what happens. So that's on my to-do list. And that would be not a super high-speed, low-drag, immediate tactical network for ATAC comms. That would just be for random messaging with people.
Yeah.
And emergency comms. Like if we set up the solar battery mesh nodes essentially as repeaters, and there's like 2 or 3 days of battery plus a solar panel on there, that would just work as long as as long as it doesn't malfunction. That just works regardless of whether or not there's power, any infrastructure stuff. And then we have emergency comms that we can use around town and just experiment with that. But for the super real-time hands-free send ATAC packet data all around, Meshtastic is very slow. The Meshtastic plugin for ATAC is pretty clunky last time I used it.
Okay.
So everybody who wants, and this is kind of my channel, is people who lean a little bit more tactical and they want to be cool operational dudes and they want to do stuff inside of ATAC. Yeah. For them, Meshtastic sounds cool because it's $20 a node. But that tactical side is really where it starts to fall down. If you want to build a community network that's affordable to get into and 10 minutes of latency between messages because the network is busy is okay, Meshtastic is awesome and the price is right. So I love them both for different jobs. And the Beartooth definitely fits that. I mean, if you're the military, these things are disposable units. If you're not in the military, $750 is not disposable.
Yeah.
But these little nodes are used by certain people in the military as if they're disposable nodes. And you throw them up in a tree and you throw them over here and you give one to this guy and you give one to that guy. And, you're working with your local security forces on the ground. You give them these radios and now they're in the network. They're on ATAC with you. Right. And if you never get them back, it doesn't matter because you just change your keys and it's no problem. So for that job, Beartooth is pretty sweet. The issue is for people who want to do that job without that budget. And first of all, I would like to ask, why? Yeah. What are you doing?
Now you're back to Meshtastic.
If you're doing that job, you should be able to get that money. But Meshtastic is just, Baofeng operators. If you get back to Meshtastic, you have something that is built for, LoRa is built for connecting refrigerators to toasters and message latency. Nobody's lives hang in the balance. So it's to be expected that it doesn't do ATAC communication real time.
There is a point there. Have you played around with the modem speed of the Meshtastics? Have you messed with the settings?
You can totally speed it up for sure. There's several different speed modes. Yeah.
So
you can speed it up. I do need to do. See, here's the problem. I have a channel called T-Rex Labs, and you think that I should do laboratory type experiments, and I totally don't do that. But that's the sort of thing I should do.
Well, so it's a really good kind of similar or somewhat of a case study. So Hamvention, which is a big ham radio fest, I produced a QR code, which you can do with Meshtastic, and it'll just set your mesh up to work on the channels that I provided.
Awesome, yeah.
Yeah, that was really great. That's kind of like here, have a Beartooth radio. Well, here, have a QR code, and boom, your unit's all keyed up. We all went to Hamvention, and we were running long fast, which is the super long range LoRa communication Meshtastic, blah, blah, blah. And we were getting network dropouts. Nobody was getting any kind of network comms through because our devices kept pinging. Here I am, here I am, here I am, over and over again, clogging everything up. So then we went to Huntsville Hamfest, which was just last month, and we brought it all down to short, and we changed a couple of key settings. No problems. Everybody was communicating. Okay. We were going from the fairgrounds up to the campsites that people were at, like 10 miles away with a good line of sight. We're communicating back and forth to them. We're sending location codes. We're planning where we're going to meet up and stuff over it as kind of like a proof of concept. And we're talking about like 100 nodes. How big of a...
100 okay, plus. Yeah, 100 nodes.
Then, so the Defcon guys reached out to me and they said, hey, so we saw your Hamvention video and we implemented a lot of changes and recommendations, and they gave that to the folks that went to Defcon. Now, take our little Piddledy ham radio show, take it to the Defcon level, and they have this tuned load of channels and modem configuration. They had very little dropouts. They were able to communicate the whole weekend long.
Interesting.
So now I'm kind of curious to hear what you're saying about ATAC, and maybe if we speed up the communication of the Meshtastic devices, then we're going to get more capability to be useful in an ATAC situation. Yeah. That's.
Do you know how big the mesh was at DEF CON?
It was like hundreds. I think I've got a screenshot somewhere of possibly.
That is really interesting.
Yeah, and they said they had very little dropouts. That is a super
good test. Yeah,
I mean it's definitely a good proof of concept. I didn't hear. I only was talking to the two developers of the system, but they said it worked really well. So I was like, okay, I'm going to have to implement that and then maybe run a bunch of nodes at another Hamfest or something like that and see, hey, you know how, you know what? No, that's the wrong one.
Well, keep going. Definitely loop me in. So by the way, I almost made it to Huntsville Hamfest.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's right. Cause you're kind of local or close enough, right?
Yeah. It would have, I told my kids about it and they were kind of excited. Not like super excited, but they were like, oh yeah, that'll be fun. But there was another event the same Saturday, so we weren't able to make it. But I'd already decided like we were going to be there.
I've got a green screen going, and so for all your audio only people, this is probably not going to look very weird. But there's some green in there, so it's getting blocked out. But all those little circles are nodes, even the ones that look like I punched a hole in my phone. So they had hundreds of nodes all throughout Las Vegas area, and they were all communicating. And if you think around those big buildings, you know, the big casinos and stuff, and they're still able to comms like that, that's pretty good. Yeah.
There's a lot of interesting 900 megahertz stuff in Vegas too. One of the things that I do when I go to SHOT Show is to bring along a Portapack or a flipper or something and just look at what's there. There's a lot of SCADA and various other 900 megahertz stuff going on. So that's a very cool experiment. I think the next thing we got to do is convince DEF CON to make their next badge a LoRa badge, because then you could do a serious test.
Yeah, that would be crazy. Then
you could actually figure out what the breaking point of a LoRa mesh would be, probably.
I think you'd find out pretty quickly. Yeah, if there was a breaking point. Do you follow the badge scene? This whole badge scene of last year or this year was pretty interesting.
I don't. I know roughly how it works, but I don't follow it as a scene. No.
They had some problems this year. They got it all sorted out eventually. But yeah, it's pretty. The badge story is pretty fun. The DEF CON badge is so cool.
So this is an area that fascinates me, but I'm not touching it. So like radio, I'm fascinated by radio, and I'm touching radio, and the edges of radio. I'm actually doing it. I'm actually doing a little bits here or there on the edge, and I've connected it to my real job. For me, my hobbies have to connect to my real job just so I can justify doing them, because I have so much stuff on my to-do list already that I got to justify it somehow. The electronics development space is something that is important. I think it's interesting. So places like Defcon and the badge scene, people who are making their own PCBs and developing that stuff, that's interesting, but I'm not touching it in any way. So I don't really understand it very well. So we need to figure out a way where it becomes part of the T-Rex Labs job for the T-Rex Arms company. So then I can justify spending some time there. So maybe.
Before we started the podcast, we were talking about Fusion 360, right? Or I don't even know, did we hit that in the podcast? But so if you remember back in the day, you had to go to school to learn CAD. You had to go to school to learn a lot of this stuff. And now you can just get Fusion 360. There's 1,000 YouTube videos. You can learn how to make your own stuff. And you buy a 3D printer and boom, you've just rapid prototyped a product that you might sell. Yes. I haven't looked into this, but I bet you there's probably a similar YouTube university you can go to on PCB development. I should look into that. There's got to be. So I know that there's in the maker space, which has changed over the years. But say Hackaday. There's tons of cool projects where people are rolling their own PCBs and sending them off to get made. And then you've probably seen this radio. I think it's the USDR radio. It's open source, and when you go to the page to order it, you may be able to order it or maybe not. But because it's open source, what you can do is you can go and you can get all the plans, and the developer, whose name I forget, tells you, like, take these plans and create an account and upload them here. And then the minimum order is 50. So get 49 of your friends and order this, and it will come from the factory. The PCB will be printed, but also all the components will be attached. And use these drop-down menus to make sure you select the right components, and some of them might be out of stock. But he has essentially the recipe for the thing, and he sends you to a place that he trusts to get the boards made, and the pick-and-place machine assembles it, and I think it's wave solder. Possible hot plate solder. I think you mean the True SDX, right? Are you talking about the True SDX?
I'm sorry.
Yeah. So that was DL2 MAN and PE1NNZ. I have to look that up. Yeah, I think that's those guys actually, they got kind of freebooted by the Chinese clones that came out that kind of copied their design. I'm sure. Yeah.
My Portapack has a fake hack RF in it too, because when you open source.
Yep.
It's a thing. Yeah. I couldn't get a real hack RF, but there were plenty of knockoffs. So, but yeah, he, those guys developed a radio and give you a path to make it. But also I was like, well, if we want to make a thing, maybe we just copy their instructions and just swap out the parts, because they've already tested this particular, PCB maker and assembler and so forth. So, I think it is relatively straightforward to do. There's just fewer people doing it. Like 3D printing is common enough now, and there's various hobbyists and makers on YouTube. If you watch the right YouTube video, you will be suggested a 3D printing video, and if you watch that video, you will be suggested a 3D modeling video, and so. You will get pulled into the thing.
I'm wondering if that possibly PCB development will become kind of like how 3D modeling and printing is today. I wouldn't be surprised if it becomes more accessible, more available, and it becomes almost like a hobbyist thing we pick up as the side. It's like, I really need this simple little device that does X, and it doesn't exist in this form factor I need it to. And oh, by the way, I need to run it off of a battery backup on 5 volts USB-C, that kind of thing, right? Yeah. I could see something like that happening.
I bet that happens when AI gets a little bit better at electrical engineering, because that is a great, I would probably trust AI to draw me a little step-down converter circuit before I would trust it to write me good computer code. So as soon as somebody builds a model that does this...
I think you're probably right. I don't know enough about AI or electrical engineering, to be honest, but I can talk about software engineering. And that might be a better use, but we're probably not there yet. That's fascinating. I'm kind of curious to see that, come in the next 10 years.
We should find some real electrical engineers to talk to. Yeah. No, my brother Noah runs the software development team at T-Rex.
Okay.
Which is, I believe, five No, 6 people. 6 people, because one of our IT guys just switched over to be a software developer. So we have, he keeps me somewhat in the loop. And, there's all these memes, like everyone who says that AI writes good code doesn't actually know what good code is. Like it's
I think it's still nothing better than actually asking somebody to just give you pseudocode on a whiteboard. That's why I wish we could go back to in-person interviews in some cases. That final interview, sometimes it's best if it's in person. Don't even get complicated. It doesn't have to be C++ or whatever. Just pseudocode me out the logic of how you do this and kind of walk through it with them. And not like it's not necessarily to challenge them on can they make it work in their head. It's how they handle a discussion when it comes to software development.
Right.
Like the feedback, the code review process. You learn a lot just from like, hey, let's talk out your thoughts here. Why didn't you do this? Why'd you do this? Walk me through it.
Yeah.
That's always really helpful.
Yeah, and that's as I've interviewed more people at T-Rex. Asking them to solve problems and then a little bit of pushback is very illuminating.
Indeed. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. So what were some of the things that you want to talk about ATAC? Well, we've had a great discussion.
Yeah.
I don't want to keep you too long because I know you have other stuff to do. You have 8 dozen hobbies plus a wife plus kids plus a YouTube channel plus an actual job.
Yeah. Like we started this, too many projects, not enough time, right? That's what we need to figure out, how to bottle someone else's time. Just buy someone else's time.
Yeah. Well, so what I'm trying to do with T-Rex, specifically with T-Rex Labs, is figure out what products I can create that have enough cash flow that we can do them properly, and then a person can actually focus on them. And instead of me just thinking it's cool and doing 30 minutes of Googling and then a YouTube video, like we actually do the thing. So I need a proof of concept, and then I need to like do it properly. So one of the things on the to-do list is the Meshtastic network, partly as a test, partly as an actual community service. I also need to install our Hytera repeater, DMR repeater, which is probably not going to be open to the community because I think we're just going to leave encryption on for the channel that we're using. And then, but I need to put up a GMRS repeater that is open to the community. And then I really should have an APRS digipeater, potentially. Now there is one in town, and I just need to figure out who's running it because I did not know we had one, and I discovered it the other day.
Just make sure you get an iGate to go along with it so you can bridge the internet. No, so for the ATAC stuff, so I obviously understand the lineage of ATAC, the history with the military, and also probably its use with first responders, particularly if you're working in a group or whatever. But on the civilian side of it, like us just playing around, what's the primary use case, right? So let's say I had a couple of Bearcats and I put one up on the roof over here, and just using your example, I've got one on my buddy, I got one. Maybe if you go out hunting, you pull up your Android phone and go, he's over there. Like, what else do you do with it? Yeah.
So I think its greatest use is first responders. So whether you are,
I see that.
I would say particularly some kind of disaster management scene. The cool thing about ATAC is that it is a standard. So if you're a civilian, it is of limited value. Like I have a love-hate relationship with ATAC too, but I actually have learned to love ATAC just as a mapping application. Like even outside of the communication side, the fact that it loads almost every map type, and the fact that it behaves like an old school application, like you give it a zip file, it knows what a zip file is. Inside of the zip file are random things, GeoPDFs, GeoJPEGs, like old obsolete data formats that nobody uses anymore. ATAC doesn't care. It can open those because it's a government project and it is used to old obsolete formats that nobody uses anymore. So it's...
I know what you're talking about on that one.
But I'm getting old enough that I appreciate that too. I don't like these flashy new programs that require, GPU acceleration on a new Qualcomm phone. It's like, I might not have that. And all my stuff is in these ancient JPEG files. All my zip files are smaller than 1.4 megabytes for some reason.
Right. Yeah. See. Okay. Now you're helping me out a little bit, because I was just thinking to myself, God, do I need to go buy another Garmin GPS? I haven't had a Garmin GPS in a long time, but that was a really useful device to have. That was just kind of in and around your sphere of whatever. You still have a compass and a map, sure, but like those are really still really, really useful. And I don't think the technology's improved because everybody's gone to cell phones, right? But now I can kind of see the argument. So you've got ATAC on your phone, you still got your ancient maps and all the other stuff, which just interfaces with it, and then you can overlay your buddies and maybe even your dog with a Mesh-tastic collar or something like that, right?
Correct, yeah. And ATAC does other stuff, which I suppose I shouldn't mention, but it just sort of works. Like ATAC will let you save offline map tiles that you don't have permission to save. Like it doesn't talk to the Google API properly, like for Google Maps. Like it will load the tiles, and then if you tell it to save the tiles, it will just save them.
Sure, boss. No problem.
So I kind of like obviously there's reasons why I like that, but I also just kind of like that level of, it uses the simplest possible execution, not always the most elegant, but it uses the simplest possible execution. Like there's not a DARPA engineer who was like, let's use the proper API. Like, no, it's just like, what's the brute force tile getter? I'll just use the most basic one.
Okay.
And so as a result, it burns through battery, but it has zero dependencies. Like you install it on a graphene phone. It doesn't ask for Google Play Framework. You install it on weird Chinese, like it will work probably on your Boox Palma. If your Palma has, if you have enough horsepower and there's not something weird, which there possibly could be.
I'm sure there is.
It should run ATAC because it doesn't have any weird dependencies. Now, so that is a kind of a cool thing about it.
Do you plot hikes in the app like that, or like what are you doing with the tiles other than obviously the overlays of other radio devices? But what else are you leveraging with that?
So what I do with it is super basic. I just download high resolution, like down to zoom level 17 or whatever of where I am. So I have, some topo maps, some satellite maps, Google Maps. Like I just have multiple layers, and you can turn them on and off, and you can just save them to the device. So now I have good maps of where I am at, and I can see my position, and I can save stuff, and I can drop pins. I really like CalTopo also. CalTopo is a fantastic app solution, and they have a version for first responders called SARTopo, which does the people sharing stuff between devices thing really well. So the reason it would be really neat to put these head to head in a couple of different scenarios, but the great thing about ATAC is it is not a subscription model like CalTopo is. I have a CalTopo subscription. I'm very happy to give them money because they offer a fantastic service. But if I forgot to pay and I couldn't get access to the servers, this is the sort of scenario where ATAC doesn't care. You just have ATAC, and if you save stuff to ATAC, ATAC never says, oh, you haven't used these files in a while. Should I delete them? ATAC doesn't delete stuff.
So oddly enough, that's kind of interesting. Everything you like about ATAC is kind of the thing we were talking about earlier, the lots of control, giving you lots of holes to trip into, right? Is almost the antithesis of creating a device that's foolproof and simple, right? It's a hole, right? You could trip and fall and crash your head all the way down, right? With ATAC.
Yeah. So I'm a pretty inconsistent person because there's certain jobs where I'm like, I need to understand this because this is important, and then I don't want the machine to do my thinking for me. And then there's other stuff where it's like, why does the autofocus not work on this camera? I just want the autofocus to work because it's not mission critical. I just want the autofocus to work. That's all. Why doesn't the AI in the camera do its thing so I don't have to think about it? But then with ATAC, it's like, no, I never want to open a mapping device and say, because you didn't check on me for 14 days, I deleted all your stuff.
I gotcha.
Aren't you happy with me?
Yeah. So I guess that's consistent. Is there are some things in my life that I would like to subcontract out to a device and just say, device, this is your job. Stop bothering me about it. You're going to sit in the corner and I'm going to provide power to you, and you go beep when I want you to go beep and do the thing. And then that's it. Leave me alone. And for a lot of people, bring this back around to amateur radio, they want the radio to be that, right? They just want it to be the thing that goes beep. They want to rely on it when they need it, and they're not going to use it to transmit most of the time. They just want to listen and all that stuff. I can see that. I can see that. And then now it's how you interface it that's important to you, right? You want this robust platform for interfacing. That's the most vital thing. Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Well,
and don't get me wrong. It's clunky. It's got a steep learning curve. The interface is old. Like you look at it and you're like, oh, why I haven't seen Android Honeycomb in forever.
Android Honeycomb. Oh my goodness. It downloaded.
It's got some ancient design language. Yeah.
It downloaded, but it seems to be stuck in approval hell right now. It wants me to do all this weird stuff about getting it approved, and so I'm playing around with that right now.
Yeah, this is true. So the other thing about ATAC, and I wish it's something that I don't fully understand. Everyone's like, it's ATAC is a trap. The government made it and it steals all your data. It is true that it asks for all of your positions, but it needs your location positions. It needs storage permissions because it's going to save stuff.
Sure.
It kind of needs, like, it has a good excuse for all the permissions that it wants. And it assumes that you are a soldier and you've been given a device that it's okay for you to have permissions on. So like, it's not trying to like make open source aficionados happy.
Right.
That's not the goal of the program.
No. And well, it's not designed for that purpose, right? It's designed for likely someone whose job it is to get these things all keyed up and set up.
Exactly.
And then dude has a screen on a wrist or whatever and sees what he needs to see and then just get on with life.
Yes.
Yeah.
Generally speaking, in most scenarios, the end user device, which is usually like a Samsung X cover or something or other, that is produced for the government, is set up by specific dudes in S2 or S3 staff positions, and they format it all, set it all up, and so you have official network communicator type guys that set all the devices up. And then you have something really cool. Your intelligence guys will create data packs. And this is the other cool thing about ATAC that I like is if I download all of my map layers that I want, and I bring in some other imagery that I want, and I drop some pins and I label some stuff, I can save that as a data package, which is a single zip file that I can just send you. And then you just open it and like, bloop, all that stuff is there.
Hey, look, it's all updated. Yeah.
Yeah, so imagine how cool that would be if you had your own like Army Intelligence Division just creating you a single zip file for your missions.
Right.
Like what could be better?
Yeah. So since we don't have S2 guys, we don't have 18 Echoes, we have to do all of this on our own, right? That's what this all comes down to ultimately, right? Yeah.
That is what it comes down to. And if you have to be okay with that, because ATAC is like, I'm not doing anything for you.
And I'm not going to help you.
You set me up. Yeah.
You tell me what you want. Well, you convinced me. I'm going to try it again. Well, assuming I can get... I've got other Android devices I'll try it on. I don't know if the Boox is up to the task, but I'll see.
Yeah. So I have a Boox Nova something, and it's so cool to do stuff with e-ink, but occasionally stuff just completely breaks because it is such a weird system. Yeah. And so I spent a fair amount of time getting OneNote working on it again. And I feel I feel the pain that you're about to go through.
Right. The undersung value of e-ink, I think, is actually being outside. So yes, you don't have to run a backlight. It just reprints the screen. You can read it in direct sunlight, which so many of the radios perform so badly in direct sunlight that it's oh, this is great. I'll just do interfacing through this little device, be able to read everything, log my contacts, do whatever. APRS, sure, why not? And just use that. That's really, I think, the selling point for getting outdoors. And also it's like, I don't know, they're like $250 if you break it, it's not a big deal. You're not out a ton. I don't know. We'll see how it goes.
I think I should do another experiment. I bought that Boox device years ago specifically to try to do map stuff with.
Oh.
And interestingly, it doesn't have a GPS device. So you're doing maps on hard mode. Like it gives you the advantage of being able to store tons of offline maps, but it still is like a paper map. You got to figure out where you are. You got to do the terrain association and compass stuff completely manually, which is a fun challenge.
So that's where you bring in your radio. But I want to try
some newer devices.
You bring in your radio with the GPS. You let it feed the GPS over the USB. And
figure out your
ports.
So there's some pretty cool stuff that could be done. The issue that I think we're running into on the land navigation space, the device space, electronic space, radio space, and maybe this is something that T-Rex can help with, and that is that there's a very small market for all these things because there's always a better, easier way to do it if you're willing to do it within somebody else's infrastructure, within somebody else's ecosystem or walled garden or whatever. So why would you save offline maps on ATAC when you could have Google Maps, that sort of thing. So Beartooth started out being a consumer device. Gotenna had a consumer device. Like a lot of these companies, they made consumer devices. Consumers didn't really want them. And so now they make professional devices for public safety, military, et cetera, because those guys already have a radio budget. It's much easier to sell somebody that already has radio budget.
And deep pockets versus a consumer base that complains all the time.
Yes, a subsidized radio budget is the best thing. That's one of the things that I hate about Motorola. Motorola has very cool technological ideas sometimes, and mostly they have ways of creating radios that fit specific subsidies that only their customers are able to get, and then they help them fill out the paperwork, and then ta-da, $10,000 handheld radio. Why not?
Yeah. When your handheld radio costs as much as a cheaply priced automobile, then you've got a problem.
Yeah. So I have anyway, we can talk about Motorola later, but there are such cool things that we could do with where we're at technology-wise. Like e-ink displays are amazing. Internet of Things protocols are great for testing certain types of data communication packages. Like all the pieces are here. And the issue is not so much that we don't know how to make these things or we're not quite there technologically, is I think the market isn't quite there. So I love the ham radio community, the gun tuber community, the firearm community, the preparedness community for thinking outside the box and saying like, hey, what if there were a better way of doing this? Or what if I had a device that did this? Or what if I had something besides an iPhone, and so forth and so on. And then if there's, because I feel like we're just shy of, just enough people to really crack this net open. People who are, all the pieces are here. Someone who just needs to figure out how to put them all together and make the thing happen. And so I'm hopeful that like your audience, my audience, various other people are interested enough that we could make some cool stuff.
I think it's evolving. I think it's definitely getting that direction. I think things like Meshtastic will look back and go, gosh, remember how that kind of started cracking the nut on stuff like this? Because a lot of that is where we want to be. We just haven't got to the points of it like doing voice yet or being able to send those pictures. But amateur radio, we can do that. So how do we figure out how to like bridge the gap, if you will? And some tangentially JS8 call, right, dancing around that kind of stuff, asymmetric communication, that kind of stuff. It's all we're flirting with the edge of it, right? We're all just kind of dancing around the edge of this, and I think you're onto something. It's coming soon, I hope.
I hope so. Yeah, I have a theory. I've never heard anybody talk about this, but I think that the Model T car was instrumental in the United States becoming a technological superpower, and that. The reason we don't talk about it is because we usually talk about the Model T as being like, this is the beginning of basic manufacturing and production line stuff. Henry Ford figured out mass production, and that is really the change. But there's a really fascinating thing that happened, which is the Model T would last almost forever. So after the Model T comes out and everybody buys it, and then later everyone buys the Model A, there's all these Model Ts kicking around, and people are just keeping them running. So I think the Model T is the reason that every boy in America knew how to rebuild an engine and fix a car and was doing fun hot rod stuff. And so when World War II rolls around, America just instantly turns into this insane manufacturing superpower, and we are just pumping out tanks and bombers and fighters like nobody's business. And a lot of people are like, well, it's just because America's an industrial powerhouse. Like Henry Ford figured out the production line, and so now we can do this stuff. And I think that's a huge factor.
Sure.
But also, Henry Ford trained a gazillion teenage boys how to be mechanical engineers or mechanics at some level. And so in the 1940s, everybody knows how to fix cars and make stuff and weld and tinker. And I would love to see us get into that space. And if we could do that with ham radio, Meshtastic, 3D printers, sort of this DIY maker space, who knows what could come out of it, or whether it's just really important to have those skills in the future for various reasons.
So in that same vein, if you think about when the discovery of radio was and what ultimately led to the FCC and countries around the world creating the licensing system was almost like free college. Because one of the three tenets of the FCC was, well, if we create a little sandbox where people can have this frequency access, a very wide frequency access of really valuable frequencies, we want to push them to be better operators. That is immediate, a value that you could sell this as a service that you provide. 2, we're going to create better radio technicians, people who can actually fix radios. At the time, everybody was getting into radios. That's a whole business market right there. And then 3, advance the art of radio, the science of radio. So the license grants you almost free college if you really want to get, philosophical about it. Because, it's giving you access to something that most people don't have. That frequency access is incredibly rare and finite in all other services that all countries make available to people. So in the same vein you were going, I think that's similar in a certain sense.
Yeah. If there was one restriction that we currently have in the amateur radio bands, or if there was a single thing that you could change or open up, what would it be? Because speaking of Garmin lobbied the FCC to open up GMRS location and data sharing a while back and actually got a permission carved out for that. So if there was another thing that you could open up that would be the most helpful for educating people, expanding the science of radio, all the things that you just mentioned, what do you think it would be?
This is an easy one, and there's actually been petitions on this. So our license is broken up into 3 stages: technician, general, and extra. And you generally have to tell people, hey, not only do you need to get your technician license, but if you want to do those really cool beyond line of sight communications, those really long distance stuff, that really experimenting, building antennas, all that, you got to get the next license, because the first level, it's really the handheld VHF,
basic,
UHF, right? You can play around with satellites. You get a little taste of 10 meters, which is, again, only open a couple of years out of an 11-year cycle. I'd like to get technician HF, some HF frequencies. Give them a taste. Give them the Costco sampler of HF, right? A little bit of 20 maybe,
nice.
A little bit of 40. I think that would really encourage people to see the wider world of what radio offers. The best parts of it from my point of view.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm trying to remember. I got my general license, and I'm trying to remember how much harder it was to make it to level 2. Level 3 felt really hard. Yeah. But
I don't think general is that much of an extra step. I think it's a hurdle that we've created because that is where we deemed it to be. It's not because it's backed by any particular scientific evidence, or people are not any less safe with a general license versus a technician license. And I've got plenty of guys who come back to me and said, well, HF's more dangerous. Well, if that's the case, we wouldn't give them access to 10 meters. We wouldn't give them access to 40 and 80
Sure.
Morse code, Morse code only. So the technicians already have access to it. Let's give them a little taste of voice, maybe some FT8 digital, something like that too. I think that would be very beneficial.
Okay. Well, I like it. Well, I'll add it to the to-do list with all the other projects. Yeah. I mean, well, seriously, we could. There's petitions now. We could get some people together to sign petitions. We could talk to Garmin, figure out what their lawyers did to make the lobbying a little more effective. Like this is actually a thing we could put on the to-do list. It feels very big and daunting, but we're watching. We're watching some changes happen. So we could add to the to-do list next to all the other repeaters.
It's come up a couple of times. So actually, the ARRL, the American Radio Relay League, has kind of worked with people who've brought this petition to the FCC. And I don't know where it's at right now. I think it's kind of sitting on the vines of the FCC somewhere and just waiting to be reviewed and brought up for vote. But don't worry, if it comes up, I will be making videos on it, encouraging people to get out there and share their thoughts on if this would be good or bad. But I think it would be positive.
Yeah. Yeah, I see enough people complaining that there's not enough folks in amateur radio that we should certainly let the people that are in cover more of the spectrum. I think, yeah.
It's a really interesting personality trait where the same people that are screaming we need more of ham people are also some of the people who scream the most vehemently that, well, you have to do it the right way, and you got to get your license, and you got to do da-da-da-da-da-da. And we know that to a certain point, adding all these different license levels is a discriminator from people getting their license, not encouraging them to get it. So it's like, well, you're going to have to let go of it a little bit if you want to grow this, unless you don't, and that's where it's going to be.
Yeah, we run into that here. Like I mentioned, we're in kind of a small town, and there's some people who are like, I don't want the town to change, but I wish there were more jobs for the young people. And I'm like, well, we're trying to grow as a company. We literally hire the young people, and they're like, well, I don't think you should have. We want to zone that for you. And we're like, yeah, but I'm doing the thing that you wanted somebody to do. So that comes up occasionally. So yeah,
I can only imagine the frustration. Yes.
It's well, like I said, as I'm getting older, I'm turning in one of those people where I'm like, well, I don't want to bring any more businesses in here. It's hard enough to buy land as it is. Gonna put a whole bunch of houses down there. I was gonna put a radio tower there. Get out of here, you city people. I'm turning into that. So
the NIMBYs, the not in my backyard, right? Is that they call it?
The weird thing is, I'm a strange NIMBY because I'm like, don't put anything in the backyard. I was gonna build a nuclear reactor there. Like I'm building the stuff that nobody else wants.
Yeah, I want the
like,
anti-air
I'm putting
battery.
in radio towers.
Yeah, I want.
I need to build a giant shooting range. Yeah.
Well, then it takes care of itself, because if you build the range, they won't want to build next to you because that's a danger to, or what they think would be a danger to other people. Right? That's
what I should do. I should go to some of the people who opposed our last range, and I should be like, look, you don't want a large housing development. I got you covered. I can solve this for you permanently. All I need is your help over here. Yeah.
I need your support.
Yeah. So ultimately, it all kind of boils down to like what people are trying to accomplish. But I think all of us could learn to be a little more consistent and a little more mission driven. Where we actually work backwards from what we're trying to accomplish, as opposed to just have knee jerk reactions against them young whippersnappers or the common trend of apps not knowing what a zip file is, that kind of thing. So,
and also just chasing the next shiny thing, right? If you're constantly changing the next shiny thing, whether it's an app or a radio or a gun or a vehicle, whatever, then your mission is constantly changing. you gotta look to make sure that you're actually gonna hit those goals by whatever the new gear is you add to your orbit. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a great closing point. Josh, thank you so much for coming on the show. Is there anything that you would like to plug, or any shiny new equipment that's coming up that you are reviewing in your next video?
I'm always reviewing something, so anytime I say something, I would have dated myself. But obviously, the Ham Radio Crash Course on YouTube, Instagram, pretty much wherever. We got a Discord, the Ham Radio Crash Course Discord. If you go to any one of my videos, there's a link to join. And since you're listening to this in podcast form, go check out my podcast, the Ham Radio Crash Course Podcast. We're all over the place there as well. So a bit different. It's me talking to my wife about radio, which is hilarious because she's a technician and not fully in with radio, but she's very preparedness minded. So we have a whole topic on preparedness and all kinds of fun stuff that takes it a bit outside of just talking about radio like my normal channel. Yeah.
Well, fantastic. I actually like to find more husband and wife teams that are doing stuff together, because it's really easy when you're super busy to just be like, I'm going to focus on this, you're going to focus on this, let's divide and conquer. But when you can actually work together as a team, that's tremendous. So yeah.
We definitely divide and conquer, but yeah, we share a lot of common interests, so it makes it really nice to work together. So it's a lot of fun.
Very good. Well, thank you for everything that you're doing. I really appreciate it. As opportunities continue to develop for new products, protocols, capabilities, I think that you and a bunch of other people that are involved in this space will have been the ones that created the audience, created the customers, created the need and the desire for stuff. So even though we may not be making all the cool stuff that we want, I think that you're moving the needle. I think that there's a bunch of folks in the ham radio community that are doing fairly thankless work at this point that's gonna bear a lot of fruit in the future.
That is incredibly kind words. Yeah, I like to hope to think that. So I really do appreciate it. And thank you so much for the opportunity to hang out and just chat with you, but also be on a podcast while doing it. That was great. So thank you.
Oh, yeah. Well, we do have a couple of ideas for offline conversations about potential projects. But in addition to that, anytime that you want to come back and talk about a specific thing, maybe do an APRS deep dive or something like that, let me know, because
there we go.
You have interesting experiences with your crowd that I think that the T-Rex crowd could certainly learn from. So let's keep thinking about that. And thanks once again for your time.
No problem. Thank you.
So hopefully you have at this point subscribed to Josh's channel, where he has all kinds of information. But if you're still watching the video, you should subscribe to the T-Rex Talk channel. I don't know exactly what YouTube wants to do with podcasting, but this is a relatively straightforward place to be. And in the comments, you can tell us what you want to see.